Hulk Hogan's funeral. Daughter Brooke Hogan gives an emotional tribute. In this deeply emotional and unforgettable video, we bring you inside the private and heartfelt farewell of wrestling legend Hulk Hogan. While the world knew him as a superstar, his daughter Brooke Hogan knew him as Dad, and her stunning tribute at his funeral left the entire room speechless. Her words were raw, real, and unlike anything fans have heard before. She didn't just honor the wrestling icon, she revealed the man behind the legend. From stories of childhood memories to a heartfelt letter written by Hulk himself, Brooke's emotional eulogy gives us a rare glimpse into the personal life, struggles, and love of a father the world thought they knew. This is more than just a goodbye. It's a reminder of what truly matters: love, forgiveness, and the bond between a father and his daughter. Watch the full tribute and experience the unforgettable moment that had even wrestling legends in tears. The sun had barely risen over Clearwater, Florida, but already, a quiet hush had settled over the town like a veil of reverence. This was not just any morning. It was the day the world would finally say goodbye to Terry Gene Bollea, better known as Hulk Hogan. But while millions of fans mourned the wrestling icon they idolized, inside a private chapel nestled behind white iron gates and swaying palms, a far more intimate farewell was unfolding. This wasn't about wrestling. This was about a father, a man, and the daughter who loved him with a depth no camera could ever capture. Brooke Hogan stood just behind the podium, clutching a folded piece of paper that trembled slightly in her hands. The room was full. Legends from the wrestling world sat shoulder to shoulder in tailored suits, many visibly shaken. Ric Flair wiped his eyes. John Cena sat in silence, staring at the casket draped in red and yellow silk. Even Vince McMahon, never one for overt displays of emotion, had a solemn look painted across his usually commanding face. But in that moment, none of them mattered. Because at the center of it all stood a daughter preparing to open her heart to the world and speak the unspeakable. The silence before Brooke began was not empty, it was thick with grief, with memory, with anticipation. She looked up briefly, her eyes scanning the rows of family, friends, and wrestlers who had all come not just to say goodbye to Hulk Hogan, but to bear witness to who he really was underneath the legacy, the fame, the immortality that WWE had wrapped around his name for decades. "Thank you," she began softly, her voice slightly cracked. "Thank you all for being here, for honoring my father, not just as a hero in the ring, but as a man, a father, and the person I knew better than anyone." A deep breath. A moment to compose herself. "I want to tell you about the man behind Hulkamania. Not the promos. Not the championship belts. Not the t-shirts or the catchphrases. But the man who tucked me in at night. The man who held my hand when I was scared. The man who showed me that strength isn't about how many people you can body slam, it's about how much love you can give, even when you're hurting inside." She paused, visibly emotional. And then, she unfolded a letter. This is a letter he wrote to me before he died. I found it the day after he passed. I wasn't going to read it, but I think you all deserve to hear his voice one last time. What followed was not just a eulogy. It was a soul being poured out. Brooke read the letter in full, and with each word, the room seemed to melt around her. In the letter, Hulk Hogan spoke of his regrets, not being home enough, letting the fame consume him, and the toll that public life took on his family. But he also spoke of his pride in Brooke, how he saw in her the light he had sometimes lost in himself. He apologized. He said he was proud. He said that if he had one wish, it was that she would always remember that Dad was the title he cherished most. There was no dry eye in the chapel. As Brooke read, footage from a projector quietly played behind her, a silent tribute showing home videos from her childhood. A young Brooke chasing her dad on the beach, Hogan lifting her on his shoulders after school recitals, the two of them sharing milkshakes at old diners. This was not the Hulk Hogan the world had seen. This was a father's love in raw, unfiltered form. But it wasn't just sentimentality that filled the air. It was honesty. Brooke didn't shy away from the darker moments either. "There were times my dad wasn't perfect," she said, her voice firmer now. "There were years where our relationship was strained. Years where fame felt like a wall between us. But he tried. He really did. And in his last few months, he fought harder than ever, not for a title, but for time. Time to make things right. Time to say what he hadn't before. That kind of truthfulness didn't just resonate, it reverberated through the souls in that room. Beyond the pain, there was peace. A kind of reconciliation that few families ever get the chance to experience, let alone share publicly. Brooke's willingness to speak about those difficult moments, about forgiveness, about healing, transformed the funeral from a simple goodbye into a full-circle moment. One that allowed not just her, but everyone present, to grieve in a deeper, more profound way. She then turned to the casket. Her hands no longer trembled. Her voice steady, though thick with tears. "Dad, if you can hear me, just know your fight is over. You can rest now. And I will carry you with me always. Not just in memories, but in how I live, how I love, and how I forgive." The final words she spoke before stepping down from the podium left the room in stunned silence. "You weren't perfect, but you were mine. And I wouldn't trade a single moment. Not for all the fame in the world." As she stepped away, the audience stood. Not out of obligation, but out of a need to acknowledge something greater than legacy. This wasn't just applause, it was reverence. Even the stoic faces of fellow wrestlers cracked open. Tears rolled down the cheeks of men who had once stood shoulder to shoulder with Hulk in the ring. Because in that moment, they weren't saying goodbye to a wrestling legend. They were saying goodbye to a man, a brother, a father. After the tribute, Brooke returned to her seat beside her mother, Linda. The two held hands tightly, bound together by loss, by love, by years of shared joy and heartbreak. As the chapel doors opened and the golden light of the Florida sun poured in, it felt as though something divine was happening. A chapter was closing, but the story wasn't over. Outside, fans had gathered silently behind barricades, holding flowers, signs, and vintage Hulk Hogan action figures. They weren't screaming or chanting. They stood in respectful silence, many of them holding back tears of their own. Some had grown up with Hogan on their screens. Others had only learned about him through stories passed down. But now, through Brooke's words, they had met the man behind the mask for the first time. WWE executives, past and present, took turns speaking after Brooke. Paul "Triple H" Levesque talked about Hogan's fierce loyalty. Stephanie McMahon recalled how Hogan always made her feel like a superstar, even as a little girl. And Ric Flair, with voice breaking, said simply, he was larger than life. But in the end, he was just a man who loved his daughter. It was Brooke's tribute, though, that became the defining moment of the service. A eulogy not of grand gestures, but of raw, genuine love. She had brought the world closer to her father. She had shown us not just who he was, but who he tried to be. And perhaps that's what makes a legacy last. Not the title belts. Not the catchphrases. But the people we leave behind, and the way they remember us. For Brooke, that legacy was a father's love, flawed, complicated, but undeniably real. And as she said her final goodbye beneath the solemn notes of a string quartet playing Real American, the very theme song that once shook arenas across the globe, there was no doubt left in anyone's mind. This was the man she loved. And this was the tribute he deserved. As the funeral service moved to its quiet conclusion, a sacred stillness hung in the air, a silence not of absence, but of reverence. The red and yellow floral arrangements surrounding the casket seemed to glow in the soft afternoon light filtering through stained glass windows, casting flickers of warmth across the face of the man they had all come to mourn. In the middle of the chapel, the casket remained closed, yet in a way, it felt more open than ever. Because thanks to Brooke's words, the man within had been revealed. In the hallway outside the main chapel, rows of framed photos lined the wall, a visual tapestry of Hulk Hogan's life. But more than the classic wrestling shots or red carpet photos, it was the candid ones that drew people in. A grainy Polaroid of Hulk kissing Brooke's forehead when she was a baby. A photo of the two of them on a boat, both grinning from ear to ear, completely unaware of the world watching. These were the images that cut deepest. Because in those moments, he wasn't Hulk Hogan. He wasn't the immortal. He was Dad. After the ceremony, guests quietly filed outside. No one rushed. No one raised their voices. Even the reporters camped beyond the security perimeter seemed subdued, understanding the gravity of what had just taken place. But among those who left the chapel with heavy hearts, none carried a weight quite like Brooke. She stood alone by the casket for several long minutes before the final procession. Her hand rested on the smooth wood, her eyes fixed, not crying now, but lost in memory. A private goodbye. A daughter's silent promise to carry forward the man who had shaped her, protected her, disappointed her, redeemed himself to her, and loved her until the end. A soft voice interrupted the moment. "Are you ready?" It was Nick Hogan, her younger brother, standing beside her with tears still clinging to his lashes. Brooke nodded slowly, then whispered, "Let's take him home." As pallbearers, including John Cena, Triple H, Shane McMahon, and even The Rock, gathered to lift the casket, there was a sacred finality to the act. The weight of it was more than just physical. Each step they took down the aisle felt like the closing line of a story that had captivated the world for generations. The chapel doors opened wide, and a hush fell over the crowd outside. Fans, some dressed in Hulkamania shirts, others in black suits and dresses, bowed their heads as the casket appeared. The string quartet resumed their soft music, but this time, it wasn't real American. It was a soft, orchestral version of What a Wonderful World. A fitting, almost ironic farewell for a man who once told the world to train, say your prayers, and eat your vitamins, and somehow managed to inspire millions by doing just that. As the casket was placed into the hearse, Brooke reached into her bag and pulled out a small envelope. She didn't say anything. She simply placed it atop the casket before the doors closed. A final letter. One the world would never read. And perhaps that was the most powerful moment of all. In an age where everything becomes content, where grief is often filtered through social media lenses and public statements, this was different. This was sacred. This was personal. And Brooke made sure to keep something just for him. The motorcade pulled away slowly, escorted by police vehicles and flanked by fans lining the street. Some held handmade signs. Others waved American flags. A few simply wept. But they all knew they were witnessing the end of an era. The burial was private. Just close family and a handful of dearest friends. The sky above the cemetery had turned a solemn gray, clouds thick with the kind of quiet grief that feels like the earth itself mourning. As the casket was lowered, Brooke stepped forward again, this time without notes, without a microphone, without a crowd. "Rest now," she whispered, her voice carried only by the breeze. "You gave the world everything. Now give yourself peace." She placed a single white rose on the casket. Then, one by one, others followed. Linda Hogan, visibly shaken, kissed her fingertips and pressed them to the casket lid. Nick lowered his head and mouthed a silent prayer. And as the last rose fell, the earth began to close. But this was not the end of Hulk Hogan, not really. Because the stories had only just begun. In the days that followed, tributes poured in from every corner of the world. Wrestlers from every generation posted photos, memories, and videos. From Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson's heartfelt Instagram post calling Hogan his first superhero, to Vince McMahon releasing a rare public video statement, there was a universal chorus of mourning and celebration. "He was one of one," Vince said in his video. "There will never be another like him." And there shouldn't be. Hulk Hogan was lightning in a bottle, and somehow, he kept that lightning burning for decades. But beyond the ring, he was Terry. And Terry was the kind of man who kept fighting, even when the cameras were off. But no tribute struck a chord quite like Brooke's, which WWE shared in full across their platforms. Millions of fans who had never seen the soft, gentle, human side of Hulk Hogan now sat in front of their screens in silence, many with tears falling freely. For once, the kayfabe was gone. And what remained was something far more powerful than any storyline: truth. Brooke's words became a rallying cry not just for wrestling fans, but for daughters, sons, parents, and anyone who had ever lost someone they loved. Her eulogy was quoted in news headlines. shared across social media, played on morning shows. But it wasn't fame she was chasing. It was healing. In one interview following the funeral, Brooke explained why she had chosen to speak so openly. "I didn't want to just talk about the legend," she said softly, "because everyone knew him as Hulk. But I knew him as my dad. And for so many years, that part of him got lost behind the spotlight. I wanted the world to meet that version of him, the one I'll miss forever." The aftermath of the funeral saw WWE planning an official tribute episode of Raw, dedicated to Hulk Hogan's legacy. But the tone was different now. Not just grandstanding. It was personal. Raw opened with the lights dimmed and a 10-bell salute. A video montage played, highlighting his iconic matches, sure, but also showing behind-the-scenes footage, family moments, and candid interviews that had never been aired before. It wasn't a celebration of an icon. It was a farewell to a father. And at the heart of it all was Brooke. She didn't need to be in the ring. She didn't need to cut a promo. Her words, spoken in the quiet chapel where the man behind the legend was laid to rest, had become the final and most powerful chapter in the Hulk Hogan saga. Because in that moment, she hadn't just reminded the world of who Hulk Hogan was. She had revealed who Terry Bollea had always been. And in doing so, she gave her father the most sacred gift of all. The truth. The full truth. Unmasked. Unfiltered. Undeniably human. And through that truth, he lives on not just in the chants of crowds or the clips on YouTube, but in the hearts of those who now see the man behind the myth. In the weeks following Hulk Hogan's funeral, the wrestling world began to shift in a way no one had anticipated. It wasn't just a matter of mourning a legend. It was the start of a deeper reckoning, a moment of reflection not just about one man, but about an entire generation that had built the WWE into a global phenomenon. And at the center of this emotional wave was not a wrestler, not a promoter, not a fan, but Brooke Hogan. While Brooke had always lived with some level of public recognition, having grown up on reality television and in the shadow of her father's fame, this moment was different. People weren't looking at her as a celebrity's daughter. They were seeing her now as the keeper of his legacy, the only one who had the courage to break the silence and show the world the man beyond the myth. Invitations came flooding in: talk shows, podcasts, sports networks, even a few book deals. Everyone wanted to hear more. But Brooke declined most of them. "It's not about attention," she told a close friend in a private conversation. "It's about letting Dad rest. I already said what needed to be said." Still, she did accept one appearance, a sit-down interview with WWE Studios, not for the cameras, but for their archives, a permanent piece of history to be stored and shared with future generations. That conversation, filmed in a quiet studio with dim lighting and no fanfare, became something of a sacred artifact among WWE staffers. Raw. Unedited. A daughter's unfiltered testimony. In the interview, she spoke candidly about what it meant to grow up with Hulk Hogan as her father. About the pressure, the chaos, the expectations. But also about the love, the real, private love that often got overshadowed by the roar of the crowd. "He always said he'd walk away from wrestling if it meant keeping our family together," Brooke said. "But the truth is, he didn't know how to. Wrestling was his oxygen. And for a long time, I hated that. I hated that we always came second to the ring. But in the end, I understood. Because wrestling wasn't just his job. It was how he coped. How he survived. And I think it was how he learned to be human." Her words sent ripples through the WWE locker room. Several younger stars reportedly broke down while watching the tribute video again. Even Roman Reigns, the current face of WWE, tweeted a rare and personal message. "Legends don't just live forever because of what they did in the ring. They live forever because of how they made us feel. Rest easy, Hulk." And thank you, Brooke, for reminding us of the man behind the mania. But perhaps the most unexpected voice came from an old rival, Stone Cold Steve Austin. In a podcast episode titled "What They Never Told Us About Hogan," Austin shared an emotional memory of seeing Hulk backstage in 2005, moments before a match neither of them wanted to do. "He looked tired. Not just physically, but like, soul tired," Austin said. He looked at me and said, "Sometimes I forget who I really am. Is it Terry? Or is it Hulk?" And I didn't know what to say, because I knew exactly what he meant. It was a chilling revelation, one that echoed the themes of Brooke's tribute. The line between the man and the myth had always been razor thin. But in death, it was finally being drawn, and not by the media or the fans, but by the people who had loved him most. Back at home in Florida, Brooke began to sort through her father's personal belongings. There were closets filled with wrestling memorabilia, championship belts, boots, robes, trunks from every era. But there were also boxes filled with more personal artifacts, handwritten notes, birthday cards she had made as a child, letters from fans he had never thrown away, and dozens of VHS tapes marked home. One evening, while going through a box of old tapes, Brooke came across a camcorder tape labeled, "For Brooke, if I'm ever gone." She froze. The handwriting was undeniably his. Her fingers trembled as she slid the tape into an old player. The screen flickered, and then there he was, older, quieter, sitting in a dimly lit room that looked like his home office. He looked straight into the camera and, for a moment, said nothing. Then, "Hey, baby girl. If you're watching this, I guess I'm gone." Her BR.